right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, The Johnson Amendment. Should Pastors Endorse Political Candidates? My name is Melissa Mercedes, and I am a Policy Associate at the Center for Public Justice. And the Center for Public Justice, or CPJ, is a nonpartisan Christian civic education and policy organization whose mission is to serve God by equipping citizens, developing leaders, and shaping policy to advance justice for the transformation of public life. We are grateful for CPJ's generous donors and faithful givers who make our work possible. If that is you, thank you so much. And we are also delighted that you have decided to join us today for a thoughtful discussion on the question of whether religious leaders and houses of worship, such as churches, synagogues, and mosques, can endorse political candidates from the pulpit. We have a wonderful group of panelists who will provide insight into the legal frameworks and theological perspectives to help guide faith leaders navigate this discussion. We will follow each panel with a time for questions from the audience, which you're welcome to add your questions, and you will be able to do that through the Zoom Q&A feature. And you're also welcome to ask your questions anonymously if you'd like. There will be an option that you can toggle for that, and we'll do our best to cover as many questions as possible. The Q&A button is on the menu bar at the bottom of your screen to the right. Now, allow me to introduce Dr. Gideon Salazar, Director of Faith-Based Policy and Research at the Center for Public Justice.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you so very much. Welcome, everybody. In Christian and Jewish sacred scripture, we find the prophet Samuel publicly anointing Saul as king over Israel. Years later, that same prophet would stand before the people and denounce Saul's kingship. For centuries since, Christian leaders, Jewish leaders, and those of other faith traditions have influenced the way their followers perceive the legitimacy of political figures and political movements. Here in the United States, the participation of pastors and religious leaders in electoral politics is nothing new. But since 1954, when Congress passed what we now call the Johnson Amendment, ministers and houses of worship have lived under its influence. For 70 years, the law has prohibited tax-exempt organizations, including churches, from endorsing opposing candidates for public office. For some, this law is a safeguard. They argue it prevents churches from becoming partisan mouthpieces and protects the integrity of both pulpit and polity. For others, it feels like an infringement on the free speech and free exercise rights of religious institutions. Just last month, on July 7th, 2025, the IRS filed a joint motion that surprised many. It read, "Communications from a house of worship to its congregation in connection with religious services, though through its usual channels of communication on matters of faith, do not run afoul of the Johnson Amendment as properly interpreted." For many, this suggested a shift, not just in interpretation, but potentially in broad federal policy and enforcement going forward. It is no secret that some political leaders want the Johnson Amendment repealed, while others are firmly opposed. What is at stake is more than tax law. It touches questions about the role of religion in a pluralistic public life, the relationship between faith and politics, and how faith leaders can and should shepherd their congregations in an election season. That is the conversation we will have today. Our first panel is dedicated to discussing the legal frameworks of the Johnson Amendment related to endorsing political candidates, exploring how current and proposed interpretations of the Johnson Amendment affect religious institutions and their leaders in our pluralistic democratic republic. Allow me to introduce you to our panel experts for the first panel. Mike Batts is the managing partner of Batts, Morrison, Wells & Lee, a national CPA firm dedicated exclusively to serving nonprofit organizations and their affiliates across the United States. He served as chairman of the Commission on Accountability and Policy for Religious Organizations, a national legislative advisory commission convened to address tax policy recommendations for Congress, the Treasury Department, the nonprofit sector, and the giving public. He is a former chairman of the board and current board member of ECFA, a national organization that accredits religious nonprofit organizations in the areas of board governance and financial integrity. And also, Theresa Lynn Sidebotham is an attorney at Telios Law, PLLC. Theresa Sidebotham assists organizations in the U.S. and internationally with a special focus on employment law, religious and nonprofit law, and child safety, and she advises on numerous misconduct investigations. Theresa has represented a variety of businesses, ministries, churches, and individual clients in advising, litigation, and on appeal, and continues to advise missions, churches, and nonprofits on legal and policy issues. Thank you both for being here with us today. Mike, I mentioned that in 1954, Congress adopted into federal tax law a provision that we commonly known as the Johnson Amendment. This law didn't pass separate from outside events or influences. It didn't occur in a vacuum. So my first question to you is what is the original purpose of the Johnson Amendment, and how has its interpretation changed over time, even before the latest IRS statement?
Yeah, well, thank you, Gideon. It's interesting. The history of the Johnson Amendment is one where there's some mystery and some intrigue. Unlike many areas of tax law, the Johnson Amendment was not something that Congress debated carefully. It was not something that was handled through committees or the like. As part of the 1954 Tax Reform Act, right near the end of the process of Congress passing that major new legislation, then Senator Lyndon Johnson from Texas introduced on the floor of the Senate an amendment to the tax bill that would add this provision that we're talking about. Stories and anecdotes have it that Senator Johnson had just come out of a bruising election campaign in which, among other things, a nonprofit organization in Texas had endorsed his opponent, and he wasn't very happy about that. So legend has it that that was his primary motivation for introducing what is now called the Johnson Amendment as an addition to Section 501c3. As we know, and we'll talk about, it states that 501c3 organizations are prohibited from intervening in campaigns, including making statements endorsing or opposing candidates. In terms of the original purpose, we don't have a legislative history to look back on like we would for lots of other areas of tax policy. But we do have what then Senator Johnson said on the floor of the Senate. He represented that the amendment would basically do the same thing in 501c3 that was already there for lobbying. 501c3 organizations are allowed to do a limited amount of lobbying, but not a substantial amount. He represented to the Senate that his amendment would do the same thing for political campaign activity. That, respectfully, was not a correct representation, but that's what he said on the floor of the Senate. So the rest is history, as they say. It sailed through Congress and became part of the law, and here we are today.
Well, I appreciate that summary. So we learned a little about the no legislative history on this, the legend surrounding this the proposal of this amendment, and its intent to counter political campaign activity. Felt maybe he was under attack on this. But Theresa, firstly, I welcome you to respond or add to what Mike has shared. Secondly, I want to say the IRS publication 1828, which is the tax guide for churches and religious organizations, clearly states that in order for organizations to remain tax exempt under Section 501c3, churches and religious organizations must not devote a substantial part of their activities to attempting to influence legislation, and they must not participate in or intervene in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. This publication I referenced is a 40-page publication, but I don't imagine most pastors devote themselves to being an expert in IRS tax law. My question for you is, what do pastors and churches get wrong and right in their beliefs about whether they may or may not endorse political candidates?
So speaking to what Mike said, I agree that, practically speaking, the Johnson Amendment ended up being much more sweeping than the intent. If that was really the intent, who knows what the true intent of a savvy politician is for what he says on the record. And it's been a confusing mess since the beginning. One of the things that makes it a mess is it's always been constitutionally suspect. Maybe parts of it are constitutionally okay. The core of it may never have been constitutionally okay. There's, many, many religious liberties attorneys over the years have taken that position. But assuming that a pastor, a church, did intend to follow it in its entirety, oh my, the ways that it's confusing. So, one thing that's confusing is that pastors can personally endorse candidates in their non-ministerial capacity, but they've got to figure out how you actually do that. If they are endorsing a candidate in church, they can't just say, oh, but this is just my personal opinion. That doesn't work. They can't carefully avoid the words endorse. That's not enough. It may still be an endorsement. You actually can bring in candidates to talk politics. If you bring them both in, you actually can bring in one candidate, but they can't be there as a candidate to talk politics. So it's hugely confusing. And there's a long list. We could go through point by point of about 20 things. Yes, you can do this. No, you can't do this. No, this is risky to do. And I think it's confusing. There's just a lot of misapprehensions. Well, another area that's confusing, you can do voter guides, but the voter guides got to be neutral. Well, what is neutral? What does that mean? Is it who wrote it? Is it the issues that they're talking about? The IRS says, well, if the voter guide focuses on specific issues, it might not be neutral. Well, does that mean you can't have a pro-life voter guide? Maybe. Another confusing area is, can you link to a candidate's website? Well, not if it's just one, but maybe if it's just the other. And maybe you can talk about issues, but if they're too closely linked to candidates, maybe you can't. It's just a hot mess.
So hot mess, confusing. Those are some keywords that I'm taking out of that. But understanding also that there are some moments in which a pastor has to decide, when am I a minister? When am I a citizen? And that line can be drawn, or can be hard to draw, especially when you are a full-time minister and that's your livelihood. The question about voter guides and what does it mean for it to be apolitical or non-endorsing, I would say, or non-opposing. So those are questions that are hard for a lawyer to answer. I imagine they're even harder for a pastor to answer. The next question is to both of you, and Mike, you're welcome to respond or add to what Theresa shared. In 1995, the only instance that I know of the Johnson Amendment being enforced against a church occurred in Binghamton, New York, where Branch Ministries urged Christians not to vote for Bill Clinton through newspaper advertisements. The IRS, citing the Johnson Amendment, responded by revoking the church's tax exemption. So we see that single case of enforcement. How might recent administrative actions or court decisions affect how the IRS enforces or does not enforce the Johnson Amendment? And Mike, I'll turn to you first for that.
Yeah, well, if I might, let me just add to what Theresa said, all of which was great. There are a lot of practical problems with the Johnson Amendment, regardless of what you may think, feel, or believe about whether it's good or not good to endorse candidates or oppose candidates. There are other practical problems with it. One huge one is the fact that the IRS has stated publicly in published guidance that if a minister or a leader of a 501c3 organization speaks out about moral issues or social issues of the day, and they do that during a time frame that closely approximates an election period, then that can be deemed a violation of the Johnson Amendment, even if they're not talking about candidates, because again, this is the IRS's position. They could say that, well, if those social or moral issues can be tied to a specific candidate, then they may very well be in substance an endorsement or opposition of a candidate. Well, that kind of rhetoric and published guidance coming from the IRS it chills the speech of pastors and leaders who want to speak out on moral issues of the day, social issues of the day, without regard to whether they want to talk about candidates. And that's not okay. It's one of the most fundamental problems with it as it exists. But As far as, your specific question, there is this case, of course, pending in Texas where the NRB and a couple of churches filed a lawsuit attempting to have the administration of the Johnson Amendment deemed unconstitutional as it would apply to them. Without getting into all the details there, the big controversy right now, of course, is the fact that the IRS has actually submitted a joint motion together with the plaintiffs, NRB and those churches, agreeing that the application of the Johnson Amendment against them would be unconstitutional, and making some pretty broad statements. You referred to that earlier, Gideon, about what is permissible in the context of a congregation or house of worship. There's a lot to be unpacked, with that too. But that's, of course, the big new giant elephant in the room. What's going to happen with that? Where is that going to lead? And that's what we're dealing with today. But there are many other very practical problems associated with the Johnson Amendment as it is interpreted and applied by the IRS.
Theresa, I'll give you some time to respond to that question about how the recent joint filing of a motion with the IRS, that development might affect how the IRS enforces or does not enforce the Johnson Amendment going forward. Oh, I think I've got you muted.
It's definitely an interesting situation. And as you mentioned, it's been enforced against one church. I think in 1973, it was also enforced by the 10th Circuit out where we are against a national ministry, Christian Echoes National Ministry. And this was also related to directly being involved in political campaigns. But despite many challenges from the Alliance Defending Freedom and others, they haven't tried to enforce it in between. And again, I think this is probably because the IRS realizes that it's unconstitutional. Now, the new scenario is interesting in several ways. The IRS has made an admission, at least that the core piece of churches speaking to their own people can't be regulated, that that's right in the center of church autonomy, of free exercise, and if any of it may all be unconstitutional, but that part is at the core and almost certainly would be. So we have a situation where the IRS has admitted it. The judge has not ruled on it yet, that I'm aware of. And even when the judge does rule on it, it will apply only to those plaintiffs. So it's not a nationwide type of injunction. It will be persuasive precedent, but not binding precedent for anybody else. Might the IRS be judicially stopped from saying anything different? Yes, that's possible. They might. But as you know, agencies tend to change their positions depending on the administration. And so this doesn't have the binding effect of a law from Congress. It doesn't have the binding effect of a Supreme Court or even a circuit court declaration that it's unconstitutional. So I think we've got to be a little bit cautious, especially when we don't even know yet what the judge is going to say. But looking at the practical effects, so ministries have always had a privilege to talk within themselves about themselves, as it were. So you can discipline a minister, you can discipline a church member for moral misconduct, and you can talk about that within the church. There's a very strong constitutional privilege to do that, always has been, under the church autonomy doctrine. And to continue the analogy, it's always been a problem if you send an email out to 10,000 people telling about the person's moral misconduct or the ministerial discipline. There you're starting to get outside your privilege, maybe getting into defamation and so forth. So I think we can say as a parallel, what the IRS is trying to concede is that within the family, the family can talk about essentially anything they want to talk about. And if they have a free exercise desire to talk about political candidates or issues or politics or whatever, they can. What the IRS has not conceded is all of the outside stuff, influencing campaigns, writing articles, making public statements, endorsing candidates, contributing, more lobbying than would be otherwise permissible. I mean, the list just goes on and on. And so, to the extent that we're thinking about this as a concession, it's a very narrow concession in an area where the IRS was almost certainly wrong in the first place. So, practical implications, a little more freedom to speak from the pulpit, and probably not a lot else. There's some of the things where the analysis has probably changed, but it's not going to be risk-free either. And we could talk more about that as we go on if you want to.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that response. So what I'm hearing as well is the IRS is using broad language, but for a narrow case that may have broad implications. And even still, though, it would require a lot more guidance and a lot more, depending on which way it went, it would need to have a lot more spelling out of some of the provisions, the things that are acceptable and not acceptable, which is going to be, it's just tricky right now. I can imagine it can be even more tricky later. Theresa, my next question is specifically for you. Some of the earliest guidance given to churches in response to the July 7th federal court filing came from the National Faith Advisory Board. In their e-newsletter under the section, What to Avoid, they said, avoid paid ads, public rallies hosted by your church, and avoid using church resources to endorse a candidate to the public. Bottom line, pastors and faith leaders can speak about political issues, candidates' elections, or public policy from their pulpit during their regular service without fear of losing their tax exemption status. So I asked you, just what do you make of this practical guidance? And can you walk us through where the lines are, legally speaking, between legal speaking about political matters and illegal partisan activity for religious organizations?
Sure. I think that guidance is very sound and practical, and it's what we might call low risk guidance. So there are and always have been pastors who, and I know they'll be talking about the theology in the next panel, but people who may feel they have a calling from God to do more and say more, and they might get away with that. But the guidance here is saying, we're going with what the IRS has conceded. It should be safe to, have pastors talk to their own congregation to keep discussions in the family. And if you're trying to have a principled approach to analyzing each situation, which then, of course, we have to do case by case, the principle is, if you're talking within the family, the pastor to the congregation amongst itself, then that's going to be permissible. When you start to speak more evangelistically, say, going outside the family, that's when the IRS is still taking the position that it isn't permissible. Now, constitutionally, that type of speech may also be protected. I'm not saying that it isn't, but we also know that, a judge hasn't ruled on that, except to a very limited degree in those two cases that we mentioned. So what's safe and what's not? It's pretty safe to talk about it in a sermon, either the issues or the candidates, if the pastor, should feel so inclined. It would be unsafe, I think there was an example given, to have public rallies, to do public articles. Now, if a minister wanted to write a public article in his or her personal capacity, making it clear that, that he wasn't speaking for the church or the denomination, that's always been permissible. So I don't think this makes the analysis any easier. There were always a lot of confusing points. Richard Hammer actually has a great list in Church Law and Tax of about 20 or 30 things that are yes or no or maybe. And I went back through the list, and 2 or 3 of them have changed to yes, and 2 or 3 of them have changed to maybe, and most of the list stays pretty much the same. So, you still have to be careful with the voter guides because it's probably going to be outside the church. Having candidates come speak, if it's just to the church congregation, that has probably changed. But and I know that usually if you have an important candidate come speak, there's some kind of public announcement, come one, come all. So I think, that's going to put you back into that space of risk again. And I want to add, as an attorney, we do advise our clients on how to avoid risk, and we prefer that they take lower risk approaches. But I also want my ministry clients to realize their first calling is to obey Jesus and to serve the kingdom of God. And, sometimes what the IRS or anybody else thinks has to take second place to that.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad that you raised that question, identifying between low risk and people identifying and understanding what their calling is. At this time, we're going to enable the Q&A feature for the audience. And as you prepare your questions for Theresa and Mike, I have one final question for both of them. Mike, I'll have you answer first, and then Theresa. Again, we're enabling the Q&A feature, so get your questions ready. Here's my question. While some religious nonprofits see the weakening of the Johnson Amendment as a step in the right direction and in line with First Amendment principles, other nonprofit organizations do not share the same opinion. One organization said, to openly abandon enforcement of the Johnson Amendment when it comes to churches could effectively turn them into unregulated political action committees subsidized by taxpayers. If the IRS is saying that churches and only churches are being given a pass from the Johnson Amendment, this clearly discriminates against other similarly situated 501c3 tax-exempt groups. My question is, are these concerns legitimate? And if so, how can a pluralistic society consider these concerns alongside the religious freedoms outlined in the First Amendment of the Constitution?
Yeah, well, let me just start out by saying that sometimes, you hear that because there have been very few publicly known examples of the IRS attempting to enforce the Johnson Amendment, there's this popular perception that the IRS is effectively hands off with churches, especially as it relates to what happens in a worship service. Well, let me tell you, I know firsthand that that is not an accurate perception. When the IRS initiates an examination or an inquiry of a church or any other organization, it's not public knowledge until and unless it becomes litigation, or until and unless there's an actual official action related to their exempt status. We have had a church client where the IRS has initiated an examination with respect to the content of their worship service. And we, together with their legal counsel, represented them through that. So to have the idea that they're hands off is just not accurate. Secondly, when we were doing the work through the commission, and to your question, it's easy to feel like, well, this was a complicated issue. It's a nebulous issue, not sure which way it ought to go. When you crystallize the issue into this question, it starts to feel clearer for most people. I would ask people, do you think that it's okay for us to have a law that says that the federal government can monitor the content of a religious worship service to determine whether it's acceptable or not? And at its most fundamental level, we all know that does not sound okay. From a First Amendment perspective, that sounds fundamentally antithetical to the First Amendment. And so, but that's what this is. That's exactly what we're talking about. That is exactly what the government can do and does. And so, the next question is, well, why would we have something like this in place? A lot of times the argument on the other side is, well, that's the trade-off. That's the condition that gets imposed as a requirement when you have tax exempt status. In other words, that's one of the conditions that you have to trade off. But then when you think about that, that may sound logical, but what you're really saying is you have to be willing to give up literally the rights that are in the First Amendment to the Constitution, free speech, freedom, free exercise of religion, in exchange for a tax benefit. And that seems about as logical as saying that, well, if you take a mortgage interest deduction on your tax return, you can't vote. And so I think fundamentally we know there's a problem here, but we're uncomfortable sort of releasing the Kraken because we're afraid of what could happen. And I really think that it's very likely that one way or another, whether it's through litigation or legislation, we're going to end up dealing with that reality. And while there may still be some limitations or some restrictions, I think ultimately churches, denominations are going to have to make those policy decisions themselves. It's important that they do that. And then, back them up, live with it, whatever you believe is the right thing for you to do, but not have the government make that decision for you. I believe that's likely where we're going to end up.
Thank you, Mike. Theresa.
Mike, that was so well put, and you're absolutely right that just because something doesn't make it into a published lawsuit doesn't mean the IRS hasn't been going after people. And then so many churches that maybe the IRS hasn't gone after, I mean, tens of thousands of churches have changed what they would have said out of that fear. And when we take it to an extreme where the government tells churches what they can and can't say, I mean, isn't this one reason that the church did not adequately stand up to Hitler prior to World War II? Because there was a pretty clear message from the government that you were going to get into serious trouble if you criticized the government. In that case, it was a little worse than taking away your tax exemption. But to your point, comparing and contrasting other nonprofits, so the law applies to 501c3s. There are a lot of nonprofits that are not C3s, and they've been free all along to say whatever they want to. And then there's the religious versus the non-religious 501c3s. Most of the non-religious ones are not preaching sermons every Sunday. They're there to save puppies or do whatever they do, and nobody really pays any attention to what they say in their membership meetings. So sure, technically they can't endorse candidates when they get together to talk about saving puppies, but it's not being monitored the way it would be with churches. As to whether it's just churches, with the way constitutional law works with ministries, it's pretty safe to assume this would apply to churches and other religious ministries anyway. Now, if we take, so right now what the IRS has conceded is only talk within the family, essentially the realm of church autonomy, which derives from the free exercise clause. They're not allowed to touch that anyway. Like I said, that's always been hugely suspect. They're still saying you can't do all the facing outward stuff. And that's true still for churches and ministries and also for all of the other nonprofits. So there's not that much difference there. If non-religious nonprofits wanted to challenge the Johnson Amendment, where they could go with it would be a pure free speech. They could challenge it on that. They could challenge it on freedom of association, that we have a right, as we say, puppies, to gather people with a similar mindset, and none of us people with a similar mindset like Senator so-and-so. That would be a freedom of association argument. They haven't done it. The only people that you hear fussing about the Johnson Amendment are the churches and ministries, and probably that's because that's where the real speech got stifled all these years. And so I think it's a bit of a false comparison to say, oh, this is favoring churches and ministries. Free exercise really is a thing and has been from the founding of this country.
Thank you so much for bringing that to light. That that we're asking churches for trade-off, and like we pointed out here, just because they're not public, there are still investigations that are happening, and churches are largely on the receiving end of those investigations. At this time, I'm going to invite Melissa Mercedes to moderate the Q&A portion of our Legal Frameworks panel. I'm going to turn that over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Gideon, and thank you everyone for your questions so far. The first question for our panelists is, what do we do about the fact that some instances of clergy endorsing political candidates and policies come from a clear ethical motivation, such as the Black church organizing politically in the American South during the civil rights era?
I'm happy to start with that one because when we did the commission work, we found a citation done by Pew Research that indicated that approximately half of African American churches actively speak in favor of or opposition to candidates, at least at that time. That was a statistic from Pew Research. And we wanted to learn more about that, so we convened an invitational gathering of African American pastors and talked about that very question. And what we learned, certainly I can speak for myself, what I learned from that, which was incredible, was how the African American church is and has been, especially since, prior to the Civil War, has been sort of the safe haven for an African American community, the place where they could talk freely about any number of things, including political issues. And you can see that whether it's through that or through the civil rights movement, which emanated from the African American church. So political speech is an inextricably intertwined aspect of African American church culture. Always has been, isn't going to change. And I think that's part of what we're dealing with here, at least for a lot of African American churches, is that's a reality. And rather than try to force some kind of change in the fundamental culture of a huge swath of churches, why don't we just, look at reality and deal with it, like I was talking about before. And that was the consensus, of that group. So I think it is a real issue, and it's one of the many, I said earlier, there are many practical problems associated with the application of the Johnson Amendment, and that's one of them.
Yeah, so if we thought about the Johnson Amendment being applied stringently in the civil rights movement, it might not have happened, because the Black church really was the powerhouse that drove the civil rights movement. And, thank God for that, because it needed to happen. And really, the great societal changes have mostly come out of the church, whether Black or white. The abolition movement, women's suffrage, care for people with disabilities, concerns about mental health. I mean, ever since the dawn of Christendom, really, care for the vulnerable and the oppressed has come out of the church. Not always perhaps in the form of political speech, but is it right to say you can never raise these concerns in the form of political speech? That's a very broad gag order, and as I said, constitutionally problematic.
Right. Thank you for your thoughtful answers. We have another question, and it's, has the judge acted on the joint motion from the IRS, and what are the implications of this?
Not as of when I checked a day or so ago.
Right.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And another question is concerned with what happens with online church services and television presentations. How does this affect them?
Well, that's an interesting question, if I might, because this lawsuit involves two churches and the NRB, National Religious Broadcasters, and the proposed joint motion states that when a house of worship in good faith speaks to its congregation through its customary channels of communication. There are a lot of important terms in this joint motion that are not defined, that being one of them. What do we mean by customary channels of communication? One would presume that with NRB being involved, they have media of some kind in mind, whether that's television, radio, internet, or whatever. But it's basically not clear. Even if this motion were adopted by the judge, approved by the judge, just like it is, there's lots of questions practically about what it means. And that's a big one. That right there is one huge one.
And probably part of the reason that it's not clear is the IRS wasn't willing to concede that much. So as they're sending this joint motion back and forth and redlining it, they're like, well, we're not going to go so far as to say, all of the online services and broadcasting. Once this is ruled on, or perhaps even now, based on the IRS's position, if I were a church that wanted to talk about online services, if I did anything political, I would preface it by saying, you all understand that this is a customary channel of communication for those who worship with us, those who are members, those who are visitors. If you're not one of the family, as it were, we're not really talking to you here. And then go on to say whatever it was that they were going to say politically.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. For our next question, we know that certain organizations depend on churches to host their rallies, and churches hosting these rallies would go against the guidance of speaking outside the family. Is that right?
So the rallies, it's a little unclear what kind of rally. If it's purely a rally around an issue and not around a candidate, that was likely allowed before. Maybe it's a pro-life rally, for example. If we're talking about a rally for a candidate that was a public rally, that would still go against the guidance. If we're talking about a rally that's a debate between two candidates, it wouldn't, but then it might not be a rally, it might be a debate. So I think this kind of thing has not been touched. It would be the same analysis that it was before, which was always a little confusing.
All right. And for our next question, is there a chance that this goes to the Supreme Court?
Well, I would just comment on that first, that with the case at hand, if the judge approves the proposed motion, that settles this case as it relates to the parties to the case. So that means presumably everybody's happy. There's nobody to appeal it. But there are parties that are trying to intervene. There are amicus briefs being filed. So whether it's through this particular case or some other one, there are multiple efforts being initiated by multiple organizations to force the Johnson Amendment's constitutionality to be litigated one way or the other. So if it's not this case, there's going to be somebody else, right behind it, coming from a different direction. Those are very active.
And there's still lots of issues that could be tested, and including some of the ones that you brought up in the questions. But if the judge decides that the joint motion isn't going to be accepted and refuses to give the order, there could be a final appealable order that both parties might want to appeal. Mm-hmm. So we just don't know. We're actually at a pretty early stage in that litigation, and almost anything could happen, really.
Thank you. And for our next question now, I am going to return to what you shared earlier, Mike, about the language of the IRS. The IRS used in this motion and their publication as well. And I was wondering, how would you recommend that houses of worship respond in the meantime, considering that we're still waiting for that clarity on some of the language from the IRS?
Great question. So the Johnson Amendment is still the law of the land. The Johnson Amendment would still be the law of the land, even if the judge approves this order. The IRS has not taken any official agency action to indicate otherwise. The IRS has published guidance out there on this topic, including publication 1828, called Tax Guide for Churches and Religious Organizations. And I'll give you a brief quote out of that publication, which is live right now on the website of the IRS, publication 1828, Tax Guide for Churches and Religious Organizations. However, for their organizations to remain tax exempt under Section 501c3, religious leaders cannot make partisan comments in official organization publications or at official church functions. That is the official guidance of the IRS. So until and unless that changes, or until and unless a court determines that the actual law or the IRS's application of it is problematic on a broad level, fundamentally nothing has changed. Now, to Theresa's point, you can make a risk-based decision about how to proceed, but that's the reality. So no matter what happens with this particular case and this particular proposed order, we're a long way from bringing clarity or resolution to the issue.
Great, thank you. And Theresa, is there anything you would like to add?
Just that, Mike is absolutely right, and I think it even opens an argument that the safest approach would be to assume that nothing has changed despite the IRS's concession and the ruling. And if a client calls me for legal advice on this, we'll walk through some of the things that we've talked about and pros and cons, and then they'll have to make a tough decision. But to play it completely safe, yes, stick with the official IRS guidance. Then the next most safe is, you're okay with that core speech from the pulpit, but not the rest of it. And then there's always people who, they just don't care because they think the whole thing is unconstitutional and they have a different calling.
Thank you, Melissa,
Thank
for
you so much.
moderating. Thank you, Melissa, for moderating that Q&A portion. That ends our panel on the legal frameworks of the Johnson Amendment. Mike and Theresa, thank you for an illuminating discussion, for lending our audience your expertise in such an understandable way. Any parting words for us before your time ends?
Thank you for the opportunity. I think this is, for those who are so inclined, I think this is an important inflection point for this issue in our country, and the implications are pretty significant. So I think prayer is always a good thing.
Thank you.
Yes, I agree. Prayer, and then, really seeking first the kingdom of God, that we're never going to get perfectly square with the kingdoms of this world anyway.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Theresa, so very much for participating today.
Thank you.
In just a few minutes, we will begin our panel on theological considerations for endorsing political candidates. But before we do, I want to ask you, the audience, 3 questions in the chat. Your answers to one or all of these questions will help us tremendously, and we're pasting them in there now. What's one thing you just heard that made you think differently? What idea made you feel more hopeful or more concerned? And what questions are you still holding on to at this point? Again, we've placed those questions in the chat, and I want to ask you, the audience, just take a moment or two to respond to one of those questions. What's one thing you just heard that made you think differently? What idea made you feel more hopeful or more concerned? And what question are you still holding on to at this point? I'll give you a few moments to give a reply to those. If you're joining us right now, we're taking some time to respond to 3 questions that we had in the chat. I think we're having a little bit of issues enabling the chat, but you can send us an email if you want. But responding to 3 questions, what's one thing you just heard that made you think differently? What made you feel more hopeful or more concerned? And what question are you still holding on to at this point? Let's see. All righty. We're now going to transition into our panel on theological perspectives. For many pastors, the legal question of can a pastor endorse a political candidate may seem clear, but the theological and pastoral question of should a pastor endorse a political candidate is far less definitive. Faith traditions differ in their approaches, and even within a single denomination, practices and convictions vary. Some houses of worship operate with complete autonomy, while others are accountable to larger ecclesiastical bodies. This diversity of governance shapes how churches and pastors navigate questions of political engagement. Just yesterday, the New York Times reported that the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America relieved a pastor in Kenosha, Wisconsin, of his parish duties after he prepared to preach a sermon urging Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to run for president in 2028. Though he still delivered his sermon, he had to do so in a borrowed event space across town from his former church. Stories like this remind us that the theological question is not simply abstract. It has very real consequences for congregations, pastors, and the spiritual and political communities to which they belong. Today, our second panel will help us explore these theological perspectives. What does it mean for pastors, religious leaders to guide or shepherd their faith community in political seasons? What risk do endorsements pose for the church's mission and witness? And where, if at all, might an endorsement be a faithful expression of a congregation's or pastor's public voice? Allow me to introduce you to our next panel experts. Walter Kim is the president of the National Association of Evangelicals. He previously served as a pastor at Boston's historic Park Street Church and at churches in Vancouver, Canada, and Charlottesville, Virginia, as well as a campus chaplain at Yale University. He preaches, writes, and engages in collaborative leadership to connect the Bible to the intellectual and cultural issues of the day. He serves on the boards of Christianity Today, World Relief, and the Salvation Army USA. Kim received his PhD from Harvard University in the Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, his MDiv from Regent College in Vancouver, and his BA from Northwestern University. Chris Butler is the director of Christian Civic Formation at the Center for Christianity and Public Life, a pastor, community organizer, and a political strategist with over 25 years dedicated to public service at the intersection of faith and civic life. Chris leads efforts to equip Christians for thoughtful and transformative engagement in the public square, encouraging spiritual and civic formation for the common good. Chris holds a bachelor's degree in civic and political engagement from Northeastern Illinois University and a master's in Bible and theology from Northwest University in Kirkland, Washington. He has been married to his wife, Aziza, for 18 years, and together they are raising 6 remarkable children. And Reverend Dr. Gabriel Salguero is the president and founder of the National Latino Evangelical Coalition and pastors The Gathering Place, a Latino-led multi-ethnic Assemblies of God congregation in Orlando, Florida. He is the former director of the Hispanic Leadership Program and the Institute for Faith and Public Life at Princeton Theological Seminary, and has served on advisory councils for the White House Faith-Based Council, the National Association of Evangelicals, and My Brother's Keeper Alliance. He holds a BA in Spanish and History from Rutgers University, MDiv from New Brunswick Theological Seminary, and a doctorate in divinity from Eastern Nazarene College. Thank you all for being here. Walter, Chris, and Gabriel, you heard me mention how the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America dismissed one of their pastors for planning to endorse a politician from the church's pulpit. The leaders of the denomination had reaffirmed their opposition to pastors endorsing political candidates from the pulpit following the IRS's joint motion last month. So my question to you is this question is for all three of you. From your theological tradition, how do you understand the role of the church or its spiritual leaders in guiding the political activity of their members or attendees, whether it be in voting, issue awareness, speaking up about political issues, or supporting political movements? Walter, I'll go to you first.
Thank you, Girien, and thank you, CPJ, for hosting this really illuminating, important conversation. I want to answer that by taking a big step backwards, because it's so easy to dive into the weeds, the details. Should we talk about this particular candidate, this particular issue, and how so? And to give us some big picture frameworks for applying any activity. One is allegiance, that our highest allegiance should be to Christ and not to any political party or platform. And, this is at the heart of what is meant by the good news. So the term evangelical derives from the Greek term euangelion, which is simply the good news. But at the time in which Jesus was having his ministry and the early church proclaiming salvation in Christ, and using the term gospel, it was a very specific term that was a political term. It actually applied to Caesar. There's this inscription called the calendar inscription, Priene calendar inscription, that was dedicated to the birth of Caesar, and celebrating Caesar Augustus' birth. And a line goes like this about Caesar, celebrating his birthday, because it was the beginning of the gospel for humanity. And that was applied to Caesar. So when the Gospel of Mark begins, this is the beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It is declaring that whatever it means to be an evangelical follower of Jesus, it is to declare ultimate allegiance to Christ over any political party, which is what enabled Christians to survive and thrive under every conceivable governmental system over the last 2,000 years. Allegiance to Christ. The second is to think about our role in society as one of blessing, whether it's the Old Testament admonition in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 29, to pray for the city, to be a blessing to the city, because that actually in turn is a blessing to one's own community. So to think about our engagements, not simply as securing our own rights, but securing the blessing of society more broadly. The third is critique and collaboration. You can see I'm doing the evangelical thing by breaking it down. A, B, C, I'm going to go to D. There is a particular role with respect to government. One is we should be a voice of critique, a prophetic voice, critiquing decisions, approaches, structures that are antithetical to the flourishing of humans, not only of Christians or other religious people, but all humans. And there are ample evidence of that throughout the Bible. But we're also to collaborate. We're certainly to pray, 1 Timothy 2, to pray for those in leadership, governing, to collaborate for the common good, to love God and to love our neighbor in the outworking of that. And lastly, the D part, discipleship. I think part of the problem that we have right now is not a weakness in our understanding of citizenship, but our weakness in our understanding of allegiance to Jesus and the implications of the good news for all aspects of society. So I think we have a deep problem that we need to address about what does it mean to be a transformed and transformational community in society in general, apart from politics. And as we do that, I think in turn, our political engagements are shaped. I know that we'll speak in more detail about this. Yeah. I'm just laying some large foundational groundwork. A, B, C, D.
That was helpful. And I'll go to Chris next for letter E. No, but Chris, you can respond to the same question about the theological tradition, or if you want to lay some groundwork as well, you're more than welcome to. But you could more than welcome to speak about your theological tradition, how you understand the pastor's role, the church's role in political activity from congregants.
Yeah, no, I also wanted first to start with thanks to CPJ for hosting this, and to Dr. Kim for laying that foundation. And I think what I want to do is maybe try to build on that a little bit further, looking to some of the tradition that I come from. So I sort of am sort of a mixed baby when it comes to theological tradition, because I am a Black Christian. I grew up in Black church in Chicago. For the last 10 years, I've pastored a predominantly Black congregation in the Assembly of God, which is a predominantly in our fellowship, especially in the state of Illinois, it's a very white denomination, and so there are a lot of currents running through here. And so a couple of things begin to emerge for me when we think about tradition. And I'll speak first of the Black church tradition, which was actually spoken about in the legal conversation. The Black church was, an invisible institution, right? Even when its adherents were still in chains, and almost immediately, when formerly enslaved folks gained freedom, and before there was really any other kind of enfranchisement, there was this movement of sort of political thought and political leadership moving through the church, which had all kinds of implications, not just electoral. It was that same sort of civic mindedness that saw schools get established, and folks get involved in all types of public work, and really helping to develop that kind of enfranchisement. And the thing that I want to note about that is that it wasn't because the government said yes or no. It was because of that larger allegiance, which is something I really appreciate what Dr. Kim said. I'm constantly reminding people that to identify as a Christian, especially to identify as an evangelical Christian, is a sort of political affiliation. It's just that it's a politics that is much larger than the scope of all of American government, let alone our very, very important, but ultimately temporal election cycles. And so this has been a constant drumbeat in Black church spaces for a long time, that we have to be involved with public life. We have to be involved with civics. And yes, that means sometimes you have to have something to say about the election, but it's all taking place inside of this much larger context. First, that very large context, which Dr. Kim did such a great job of laying out, but also inside of a larger context of what does it mean to be a civically engaged church, a civically engaged tradition, and then coming in that sort of evangelical vein, and even the Pentecostal vein, there is a real connectivity, at least as the tradition has been passed on to me, between this heart for souls, right? To see people come to know Jesus, and having a concern for the sort of physical well-being of folks who are in the community. We heard the reference to Jeremiah 29, this idea that as we are seeking peace in a city, and again, that doesn't just mean elections. That means, what does it mean in Chicago to be on the front lines, making sure that we're improving the quality of our schools, that we're standing up against violence in our streets. All of these things are civic questions, and they remind people that there is a benevolent God who cares about them in every dimension of their person, and we want to see that same benevolence and that same concern modeled in the body of Christ. And so that necessarily requires this sort of civic engagement. And anything we do in electoral politics and electoral conversations, I think always has to be inside of that frame of a larger understanding of what does it mean to be involved in sort of civic life and public life in the community.
Thank you, Chris. Dr. Salguero.
Let me echo the gratitude from my old friend, Dr. Walter Kim, and my new friend, Chris Butler, to CPJ and Girien and Melissa and the whole staff for putting this together. Look, I think since Dr. Kim laid a good foundation, I will try to elaborate a little bit on that as a kind of point of departure. I often see the church's role in two functions, the pastoral and the prophetic. The pastoral comes alongside. It's a theology of accompaniment, of healing, of leading to flourishing, of comforting. And the prophetic, which is to announce and to denounce, right? The prophetic doesn't just denounce, it announces, and denounces, as the Bible scholar Walter Brueggemann says, it announces what is good, what is beautiful, what is true, what is just, and it denounces what is unjust and what is broken, and what is evil. And so those two roles, I think, inform how I view the role of the church and the role of the pastor, whoever he or she may be. I think using the taxonomy that Dr. Kim spoke about, I think that taxonomy of allegiance and blessing and critique / collaboration and discipleship helps the church inoculate itself against four temptations, if I will, in our engagement in the public sphere. I think allegiance, if we understand our primary allegiance to Christ and his gospel, inoculates us from idolatry, partisan idolatry, and political idolatry. Blessing, I think, inoculates us to indifference. It's not just our own blessing. We seek the shalom of the city and the neighborhoods and the nation wherein we live. Jeremiah has been already quoted. Critique and collaboration isolates us from isolation. With all deference to Stanley Hauerwas, I believe that Black church and many other traditions showed us that isolation can lead to long-term injustice in communities we seek to love and contribute to their human flourishing. And fourthly, discipleship or catechesis delivers us from ignorance or kind of religious populism that seeks superficial answers to complex issues. As we've seen today, I don't know how many times I heard in the first part, this is complicated and it has not yet been resolved. And so we seek to understand deeply. I am deeply influenced by the writings of Dr. King and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who reminds us that we are not the ministerium, we're not the servants or the magisterium or the Lord, we're the conscience of the state. And sometimes that calls us to collaborate like Nehemiah and Joseph and Esther. And sometimes that calls us to critique like the major and the minor prophets and John the Baptist and Jesus himself. And so I think that delicate posture, balancing pastoral calling and the prophetic calling of the church as part of its apostolic calling, being sharing the gospel, the Evangelion. I think that's where I see the church, especially in a religiously pluralistic democratic society.
Thank you so much. So we got a reminder from that right now about how the role is bigger than the election season. It is an allegiance to Christ, and it involves reminding ourselves about the role of the gospel, blessing our communities, critiquing, collaborating with others, and engaging in discipleship. We saw here also understanding the difference between the pastoral role and prophetic role. And what's great about being in a panel with pastors, everyone here has a 4-point sermon for this next weekend. Here you've got allegiance to Christ, blessing, critique, collaboration, discipleship, and then you have what they inoculate presented so well: idolatry, indifference, isolation, and ignorance. Chris, I'll direct this next question to you regarding the endorsement of political candidates from the pulpit. An Episcopal bishop overseeing the Detroit area was quoted saying, "It's never been about whether or not I'm going to lose my tax exempt status. It's whether I'm going to lose my prophetic status." My question to you is, what are the potential risks and rewards of religious leaders endorsing and not endorsing political candidates from the pulpit?
Yeah, so as somebody who has been involved in a lot of political campaigns, run for office and those types of things, one thing I would first say is like step back and look at what we mean. If I'm working for a political campaign and I go to any individual or institution and ask them to endorse my candidate, I'm essentially ask them to do a few things. Number one, you're going to put your stamp of approval as an individual or as an institution on my candidate. You're going to say this person meets at minimum a basic bar of acceptability to what it is that I as a person or we as an institution, what we represent. It also includes making a recommendation to any members or followers to exercise their sort of electoral powers on behalf of this candidate. So if you're going to vote, vote for this candidate. If you're going to volunteer, volunteer for this candidate. If you're going to give, give to this candidate. And then in many cases, we're asking to leverage the resources of the institution itself on behalf of the candidate. So the institution can give, the institution can run ads and use their platforms, all those types of things. And so this is if this is what a political endorsement is, are there risks and rewards to pastors and churches participating in this way? And I should rush to say, I'm not opposed to, I'm very pro churches being involved in the electoral life of the community that they serve and in which they participate. But this question of endorsing candidates is a tricky one. There are a number of risks that I think come up if you add your endorsement to a candidate. Doesn't mean that you don't celebrate ideas. I like that framework of announcing and denouncing. We've got to announce and we've got to denounce a lot of things. But if you're going to endorse a candidate in an election cycle, you're putting credibility at risk, in my opinion, because you in this larger sort of civic participation that the church has, you want to have a kind of prophetic clarity. And when you endorse a candidate, assuming, which I think we all can, that there's not going to be any candidate who perfectly embodies everything that the church believes, you're beginning to weigh these sort of values that we stand for as the church and say that this one is more important than the other, and that begins to get tricky in my opinion, and you lose credibility that way because you begin to weigh that thing and you muddle that sense of moral clarity. I think when you endorse a particular candidate, there's also unity that is at risk at the congregational level and also at the larger church level. I have a lot of experience being in the sort of policy minority and various sort of constellations of church coming together, again at the congregational level and also at other larger levels of Christians coming together. And you don't want to diminish, disregard and overlook folks who may be in the minority inside of your congregation, inside of other areas of fellowship. And then a third risk is that I think you begin to handicap the main goal of the church, which is discipleship. There was a young woman came up to me in the church that I lead and literally asked me if she should marry the guy she's dating. And every pastor kind of knows that the answer to that is I don't tell you, I'm not going to tell you yes or no, should you marry this guy. What I can do is walk you through guidance. What should you be looking at? What kinds of things should you be paying attention to? What are the conversations that you should be having in order to come to the right conclusion? And when we stand up and say, well, just vote this way or think, this way about this particular candidate, you begin to take steps to handicap the larger goal, which I think is to disciple folks in a way that they can discern these questions for themselves. If there are rewards, I think that they mostly move quickly in the direction of perverse incentive, because the things that you get from political candidates and eventually elected officials, when you give them your endorsement, you're currying favor and access and maybe down the line other types of of favor. And if you get those things because you stand on principles consistently and you are working together with an individual who is in political life and has values that align with the values that you stand for with clarity and consistency, I don't think that's a big problem. But I think we begin to undermine the church if we allow this to be a thing where we're endorsing candidates, and then the candidates that we endorse support us, and the ones that we fail to endorse or oppose begin to use their political power against us. We lower what we're trying to do in a society as a church, in my own opinion.
Thank you so very much. From that, I gather how you define an endorsement and some things that are at risk: credibility, unity, and obstruction to the main goal of the discipleship. That, incentives or favor does occur, but it can also occur without having to endorse specifically endorse a candidate. Dr. Salguero, firstly, I leave it to you to whether you want to respond or add to what Chris shared. But my question for you is, in what ways can religious leaders promote political engagement by their parishioners without compromising their church's prophetic witness?
Well, first, thank you. I want to echo a lot of what was just said. I do think that there's a high risk to endorsing a candidate, not least of which is in the public sphere. People might assume you endorse everything that candidate does. And when that candidate inevitably falls short of the gospel, as we all do, your name has been attached with that. And so I think that the credibility of the witness of the gospel is very important. And the unity of the church is very important. And I want to add this section, which I think Chris was referring to, which is unity does not mean uniformity, right? Centrism is not a gospel virtue. Oh, I just because I want to avoid tension, I won't speak about an issue. I don't think that's what the gospel calls us to. The gospel calls us to cruciform nature, and that takes risk. And so I'll piggyback on what Chris has said in response to your second question, which is at the heart of civic engagement is discipleship and spiritual formation for public life. Spiritual formation for public life. And I think our Catholic colleagues have developed a robust moral theology that many evangelicals and Protestants can refer to, even as they develop them from our own theological and convictional platform. And I remember Tim Keller actually speaking to this. He says, we need a more robust spiritual formation for public life. I agree with that. What that means is silence is not an option. We're called to be a prophetic voice and a pastoral presence. And so what that means is we speak to issues, but we speak to issues from a gospel-centered perspective. I think one of the biggest challenges is that we, either from partisan lenses or profoundly ideologically linked lenses, without looking closely at the gospel. What is it the gospel has to say about this issue or these issues? And so, to be clear, when you speak from a gospel-centered perspective on issues, it will rattle some cages and it will disrupt principalities and powers, as Walter Wink reminds us in Engaging the Powers. And so that's okay. But I do think that our a priori, our philosophical and theological and pastoral foundation should be the gospel. That means we need to know the gospel well. We should know the gospel well, and we should know the issue well, so that we can speak with gospel clarity on the issues. The second thing I would say is, and here I draw from St. Augustine of Hippo in his book, Civic, The City of God, is we have to seek the summa bonum. What is the highest good, right? And this is the question, the pastoral ethical and Christian ethical question. The difference between isness and oughtness. Just because you can endorse a candidate, does that mean you should endorse a candidate? The difference between just because something is legal doesn't make it good or moral. That's the question of legal positivism. There's a lot of things that were legal that were not moral. Slavery was legal and not moral. The disenfranchisement of women, from where I sit, was legal in our country, but not moral. And so the Christian, she or he must always ask themselves when they're preparing the church for public engagement is, what are the theological and biblical underpinnings that inform this? I speak a lot about immigration, and there's a lot of heat and very little light on immigration. And there are a variety of well-meaning people with different opinions. What I do hope is that we can come together with the counsel of the prophet Isaiah. Come, let us reason together. And in this reasoning, as Christians, we have a shared sacred text that should inform us on that. And I think that is the fundamental problem. I don't think silence is an issue. And some pastors, I'm a pastor of a church, 15 nationalities, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, are afraid to speak because they'll lose people in their church. Well, that may happen, but don't do it. Don't lose people because you're hyper partisan or you have political idolatry or because your ideology is driving your narrative. Give people the choice, but always present it through the lens of moral, biblical clarity.
Thank you, Dr. Salguero. Dr. Kim, my next question is for you. And you've heard both Chris and Dr. Salguero, so you're more than welcome to respond or add to their comments. But my question for you is, how can religious leaders and lay leaders form Christian communities that cultivate practical political involvement, including electoral activity, while resisting blessing one or the other political party?
The richness of this discussion has given me a lot of threads that I can pull and try to weave together, and I appreciate that, being able to work together on this. I want to pick up on this whole notion of civic engagement as a function of our discipleship. You know, that there's a highly individualistic, personalized, existential way of thinking about religion in America. What is my personal transformation? How is my personal marriage going to be put together, or raising kids, or what's God's vision for my work? But primarily, what's my vision for my work that would be personally satisfying? And so having a spiritual formation that shapes us in our public life is, in fact, I think, the work of the good news of Jesus Christ, right? I go back to Luke chapter 4, when the Spirit of the Lord anointed Jesus to proclaim good news. It was to proclaim good news to the poor, freedom for the prisoner, sight for the blind, release for the oppressed. There was always this personal but also public implication to the good news that Jesus would proclaim. So it's a matter of discipleship. And I would say, in this regard, if we want to get at a robust political discipleship, we need to get first at a robust public discipleship, that the public has to come before the political. And what I mean by that is, before we think about election cycles, let's think about what are we doing within our communities? Are there groups that we're engaged with? Have we been involved with the public school system and education, tutoring? Do I understand what the different economic zip codes might be in the area that I live in? And why are they this way? What I often discover when churches are engaged, or I myself personally are engaged in the public and civic life, not just the political, what I'm going to vote, but who do I know? What communities have I engaged with? It does two things. It raises my level of empathy, but it also creates a greater imagination. It raises my level of empathy for the people. They're no longer just political issues that get bounced back and forth between your favorite networks or unfavorite networks. They're about real people, real communities, and it creates deep empathy. It also creates empathy about the complexity of the issue. Oh my, no one policy is going to solve the problem for this group of people that I've just interacted with. What do I do with the kids at school who don't have enough to eat and can't concentrate at their school? Is there one policy that's just going to solve all of that? So it creates empathy for people. It also creates empathy for the political complexities, but it also creates an imagination. It creates that politics can be a part of a multifaceted response to issues. And it puts it in its appropriate place. As already been referred to in terms of endorsements, First Corinthians 10 talks about, I have the right to do anything, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. So that's been amply drawn out by my co-panelists there. But it's a deeply biblical notion to pursue the wisdom of the mission of the church. And so as we do this, I think we create a form of engagement that in turn is a bit more upstream from the political election cycle. Well-formed people who live out their faith, not just as individuals, but as corporate identities within the community, seeking to tackle complex problems and confronting the barriers as well as the limit boundaries of what a local church can do. You begin to realize, oh, we actually do need all segments of society that God has ordained. Law enforcement, education, yes, politics. And we could be a part of this, both critiquing it and collaborating with it. And I would
Thank you,
deeply encourage that form of engagement, because you don't have to wait until the election cycle, and you don't have to reduce it to whether you're going to vote for this person or that person, or sound bites about policies that you might repudiate as unchristian or very Christian. You go upstream to the deeply formational and missional part that politics should be downstream from.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. So if your church is wanting to figure out how to engage politically, the recommendation here is first engage with the public preceding the politics and finding out what issues matter in that area, but also what crises people are dealing with and how they're wrestling with issues, like you said, in school, whether it's hunger, and that could be a great place to start. So if you don't find yourself or your church technically ready to maybe engage in the political sphere, well, you're a part, and your church is a member of the public community surrounding, and you can engage there. And I like to think that at CPJ we try to do that and equip citizens so they can engage in the transformation of public life. And it doesn't just include policy; it includes getting involved in many of the other public institutions that are available. At this time, we're going to enable the Q&A feature for the audience. As you prepare your questions for Dr. Kim, for Chris, for Dr. Salguero, I've got one final question for all of them. We might be short on time, but perhaps we can get through this question and get to a few questions from the audience. In moments of moral crisis or political emergency, how can pastors speak clearly without becoming partisan mouthpieces? I'll ask Chris to answer first. You want to go ahead?
Yeah, and I'll be brief. I think Dr. Kim's question, answer to the previous question, actually gets at this in a really precise way. Usually, when somebody asks me this question, the real question is, how do I respond in the midst of this crisis that I was not prepared for? So I'm not involved in the life of my community. I don't do much in the church teaching and discipling in terms of family formation and sexual ethics. And now there's this big question, and everybody expects me to have something to say. What you really want to do is be able to keep saying what you've been saying. And it's actually the environment has changed. And so, now this is not just, any pitch, this is bottom of the ninth, World Series, bases loaded and accounts full, right? So it matters more. I was going to have a larger impact, but the best thing is to be able to just keep doing what you were doing, keep saying what you've been saying, because you're involved in these questions, whether or not there's a crisis, whether or not there's an election. If you come to the moment and you haven't been doing it, you still have to go through the process. You have to look closely at the gospel. You have to try to discern and understand what is the implication for my community and all the factors that we've talked about throughout this conversation. And then you do the right thing and let the chips fall where they may. Somebody is gonna, I don't like for folks to not say what you need to say because somebody's going to accuse you of being a partisan mouthpiece. As long as you know and you are confident that you are being a mouthpiece for the Lord, an ambassador for Christ, you got to do that thing and somebody might accuse you of being partisan in some way, but you have to do the work and know that you're speaking with the kind of clarity that you need to do.
Dr. Salguero or Dr. Kim?
I would say be gospel-centered. Make sure your response is rooted in the gospel. Don't be afraid. You cannot control people's interpretations. You can only control your intention. And so be intentional about representing Christ and his gospel well on the issue. And thirdly, be deeply informed. Superficial answers usually lead to more problems. Deeply informed, gospel-centered, and courageous. And lastly, I would say is kindness goes a long way. It's not just what you say, but how you say it. Truth without love is no good. And love without truth is about the same.
The things that have been said, I just say ditto to all of that. And one last maybe practical application would be to tend to your own well-being, because many of our worst decisions come when we are making decisions out of fear, or we are not grounded, or we're simply seeking approval, or we're complicit within an anger cycle, and we're spiraling down. And there are plenty of opportunities for us to enter into all those emotional spaces right now. If we lead out of them or react from them, more often than not, even if we're quoting the Bible, we're often going to be doing it in ways that are deformed and contorted. And so get yourself in a good spot so that it's truly not out of a indignation or an anger or a fear that you're responding, but a deep faith aligned with the passions of Christ.
Thank you. At this time, I'm going to invite Melissa Mercedes to moderate the Q&A portion. I think we've got a few minutes to take a couple of questions from the audience.
Thank you, Gideon, and thank you all for your answers so far. We have a first question for you, which is, when approaching a particular issue, how should pastors negotiate nuance with their discipleship and teaching their congregations?
Carefully. That is a great question. And nuance is such a difficult word to even elaborate when you're teaching, because some things are axiomatic and they're absolute truths. And when pronounced, they can appear to lack nuance. And so what I would say is there's a certain posture when teaching and forming and being formed that helps people receive it. Jesus himself was not averse to challenging people and telling them, this is not reflecting the heart of God or the principles and values of the kingdom. And so I would say nuance is not just like the content, although it is the content, it's also the delivery on how you do it. I'm a pastor and I struggle with this all the time. I preach every Sunday. I do Bible study. I counsel people. I have couples who voted in different directions. It's just a wonderful plethora of people. And I think that nuance is you're careful in analyzing what you're saying and that you're trying to be as objective as you can be, and you're doing it with tactful, but you're not afraid to present axiomatic truths in ways that can be heard.
And I would just add, I think one of the things that we hear even in Dr. Salguero's answer is that there is a level of humility that we should approach scripture with. Like even those of us who hold very, very, very high view of scripture, we should never hold that same high view of ourselves and our own capacity to to own, to know, to walk out. And so just I think that sort of posture that Dr. Salguero was talking about grows out of this idea that we are finite, imperfect vessels trying to live out, and in the case of pastors trying even to proclaim and to teach this word that is infinite and perfect. And if we approach it that way, I think that you do a lot to get to the place that we just heard described.
All right, thank you. And this is going to be our last question for the sake of time, but so biblical discipleship includes that we work out the implications of the gospel for the careers of Christians in government positions. So what does this mean for people who work in government and also share the Christian faith?
I think everything that has been said applies. That there is a very well-formed way in which our engagement in the public sphere forms our political life. And those who are in politics and the actual work of government need to also think about their role both as servant and to use Dr. Salguero's template, maybe both as a prophetic and a pastoral presence within their work, within their vocation. And I think this is the job for those who are within government as much as those who vote people into government, of what does it look like to pursue your vocation within government that leads to the flourishing of societies and that would bear witness. I think Christians who are involved have an even greater impetus. And I'm going to refer back to the Old Testament in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4. It says these laws were given to you, not only so that you could obey them and live well in the land that God is promising to you, but it also says so that the nations that look at you will say, what kind of God would give to this people such righteous laws? So in other words, it was both about the flourishing of God's people under a political system, but it was also the witness that we could bear. So for those in government, I would say you are a part of that work of pursuing policies, laws, practices that as a Christian, you have a higher allegiance that's forming your vision of flourishing, and you're speaking into that with the goal that insofar as by the grace of God, even a secular government like ours could have laws and practices that would bear the aroma of God's grace, whether or not it's recognized as God's grace. This is the ambition, the goal, I think, for all of us, whether in public service, in a generic civic way, in pastoral service, or in governmental service. It's in some ways the same vocation, just in a different domain.
I want to echo that. That's excellently said. I want to end where Dr. Kim began. In public service, whether you're a city councilman or woman, an alderman, a mayor, a vice president, always analyze deeply your primary allegiance. That your primary allegiance is to Christ and to Christ's gospel, and the teachings of Jesus. Let your light so shine before people, so that they can see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. And so you live that out based on a gospel formation. No matter what political party you work for, no matter what level of government you work for, that primary allegiance to the gospel is grounding how you live, how you act, how you legislate, how you interact with people from different sides of the political spectrum, or people who agree with you when they're not aligned with the gospel. And so that gospel centrality helps you shine your light in whatever sphere of government you may work.
Yes, that is all so helpful. And if I can just say maybe one word to those who may be pastoring folks who are working in government and working in politics, I do think we need to be more and more diligent as our sort of political life is becoming whatever it is becoming, um, to understand all of what the previous two panelists have just said about what it looks like and what it means. That these are folks who are in vocation, just like all the rest of the members of your church. And so, the same way that you're not going to like hold, the person who like works at the Pepsi packing plant accountable to everything that the CEO of Pepsi says or does in the world. The same thing has got to hold for folks who are working throughout government. A lot of folks, especially those who are working in civil service, are in pursuit of flourishing in pretty discrete roles inside of government. And for them to feel the pressure, especially within the church community, of having to, sort of defend, explain, negotiate everything that a political party or political or government leader does, can be exhausting, honest. And I say this as a person who spends a lot of time doing ministry specifically on this question with folks who are working in politics and government, and trying to discern what does that mean to really live out this sort of broader Christian call and ethic in the context of doing this work. We live in a society that would easily want to shame, pressure, and bully folks who are working in government and even working in politics in some ways, in the sort of broad paintbrush way. And I would remind us who are trying to lead Christian communities that most of these folks, I mean, like if you've got like, there are people who have a lot of power in politics, but most of the people who are working throughout our government and our politics are actually doing very discrete jobs inside of organizations, just like all the folks who are in your congregation. And we've got to try to remember that as we lead the congregation and disciple all the folks inside of it.
Thank you so very much. Well, that is going to end our panel on theological considerations for endorsing political candidates. Dr. Kim, Dr. Salguero, Chris, thank you for your pastoral voices, your prophetic witness in our webinar. Any parting words before we sign off?
It's going to be okay. God's still in control.
Yeah, just a word of gratitude, one more word of gratitude to CPJ for hosting us and for all the folks who participated. I think the fact that you are in this webinar means that you're asking the right types of questions and that you're probably the kind of people who we really need in our churches and in our politics today.
Yeah, thank you again. And as Dr. Kim and others have said, the arc of the moral universe is law, bends towards justice.
Amen. Well, thank you so very much. 2 final items for you, our audience. First, in the chat, you will again see 3 questions. Please take 1 minute to answer one or all of these questions in the chat. They will help our team tremendously. Those questions again are, what's one thing you just heard that made you think differently? What idea made you feel more hopeful or more concerned? And what question are you still holding on to at this point? Second, as a benefit to you, everyone who registered for this webinar will receive a follow-up email with articles and links that were mentioned or referenced today, and resources from some of our panelists, such as a report by the Commission on Accountability and Policy for Religious Organizations. If you don't receive anything, you can email our offices and we'll provide you with that information. Again, thank you for attending today's webinar, The Johnson Amendment, Should Pastors Endorse Political Candidates, hosted by the Center for Public Justice. God bless you all.